Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. We'll be starting in just 1 minute. I'm giving everyone a second to get on the call. Hello and welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the preview of our new 7-week online course, Thriving on Complexity, Practices to Transform Complex Challenges. My name's Stephanie. You may have seen my name in some emails. I'm Meridian's course manager. I'll be your primary contact for any administrative questions or support that you may need throughout the course. On our call today, our call engineer is Shauna Villas-Sater. Leading the call today, we have our two faculty members, Aftab Omer and Zach Stein. I'll turn it over to them soon for introductions. This webinar is going to last about 1 hour, with the last 15 minutes reserved for interactive questions and comments. In our call today, Aftab and Zach will introduce you to the main themes and approaches that will be covered in our upcoming 7-week course, Thriving on Complexity. Please note, when you join the call, your audio was automatically muted. This helps us reduce the amount of audio feedback and background noise. You have two options for viewing this webinar, gallery view and speaker view. We recommend speaker view if the group gets large enough. You will find the icons to switch between views on the upper right-hand side of the webinar window. We encourage questions and comments throughout the call. Due to the number of participants on the call today, we ask that you submit your comments or questions using the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will try to take as many questions as possible throughout the last 15 minutes of the call. In order to submit a question or comment, you'll just need to click the chat link at the bottom of your Zoom screen, select the comments and questions from the participant column on the left-hand side, and then submit all of your questions privately to the questions and comments. You'll notice that there's an option to submit your question to everyone. We will not be able to respond to questions or comments submitted to everyone. We will only be able to respond to questions and comments submitted to the participant comments and questions. And we will begin to take questions and comments at about 10:45. I would like to hand over the mic to Zach Stein now to launch your introduction to the course as they engage in an inquiry on thriving on complexity. Zach, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Trying to get my slides to share here, but that'll be sorted in a second. So it's a great pleasure to be here and to be introducing this course, which is one of the most exciting things I've been involved in during the course of my whole career. The topics are really crucial to the time that we live in, and some of the principles and practices we're going to be presenting are true medicine. They are very powerful. So I'm going to move now to a PowerPoint presentation, and I will be handing it over to my dear friend and colleague Aftab Omar. He is the closest thing to a wizard I've ever met. I'm inspired almost every day by his heart and mind, and he and I will be your guides. So Aftab, please take it away.
Thank you, Zach. It's a pleasure to collaborate with you as well. And welcome, everyone. I've always loved philosophy, but have had to ask God to protect me from philosophers. However, Zach, who is a philosopher of education, is for sure an exception. And the way his embodiment of philosophy comes through has been a real pleasure to work with and build this course together in full collaboration. So before we go much further, let me mention to you that this is an overview of our 7-week course. And that means a 30,000-foot overview. So in a sense, this webinar is going to be quite different than the course itself, because the course is going to be grounded in practices which are connected to distinct capabilities and that are responsive to complexity, overwhelm. But the webinar is a 30,000-foot flight, and it may be a bit of a bumpy flight because our team, our communications team here at Meridian, is new to Zoom. We really like this platform. We've tested it for the last few months with about 20 people or so. And today looks like we're a little over 50 people. So it could get a little bumpy. So let us begin then our journey and take a minute of quiet together, and then I'd like to read a poem by our Austrian friend Rilke to you as a way of helping us arrive into our inquiry today. So here is an image from Rilke about what thriving on complexity can feel like, can look like. This clumsy living that moves, lumbering as if in ropes through what is not done, reminds us of the awkward way the swan walks. This clumsy living that moves lumbering as if in ropes through what is not done reminds us of the awkward way the swan walks. And to die, which is the letting go of the ground we stand on and cling to every day, is like the swan when he nervously lets himself down into the water, which receives him gaily and which flows joyfully under and after him, wave after wave, while the swan, unmoving and marvelously calm, is pleased to be carried, each moment more fully grown, more like a king, further and further on. So we might say that perhaps that the swan while on land is in some kind of state of complexity overwhelm. That the fit, the alignment between the swan and reality finds its thriving, its zone of thriving when the swan has gently, nervously lowered himself into the water. And so here on our slides, you're seeing one way we have come to articulate what complexity overwhelm is like, not just as a feeling or emotion individually, but as applicable both individually and collectively, both in the sense of interiors and exteriors. And we recognize that complexity overwhelm is a challenge of alignment, of fit. So the challenge then is, how do we meet complexity challenges? How do we transform complexity challenges? And what are the capabilities that let us do that rather than being overwhelmed by complexity? And so here it's helpful to have a better sense of, well, what is a complex challenge? So not all challenges, not all difficult challenges are complex challenges. And there are different ways to differentiate between these four kinds of challenges that you're seeing on the slide right now. Zach and I are looking today to keep our webinar on complexity simple, the right kind of simplicity. So in that spirit, I'll just say today that a complex challenge is a challenge that cannot be surmounted either with the appropriate development or with necessary development. So the fit between the swan and the water, we could imagine as a question of developmental alignment. If the development is there, we can transform the complex challenge. Or the development has to happen. So, of course, there's a lot more complexity here in what a complex challenge is, but we'll let it for today. In our 30,000-foot flight, we'll let it go here. So we can go through these slides as quickly as we can and really make as much time as we can for the kind of interactive inquiry that the course is actually about. And we'd like to get as much of that into this webinar. So then, our next slide is a thumbnail attempt to map in a very rudimentary way the complexity of reality. So here we're showing in a single word 5 principles that apply to transforming complex challenges. There are just 5 principles? Of course not. There are many, many more that could be articulated. That could even be as important. But again, this is our attempt for today to get on the far side of the complexity that is inherent to our topic. And bring down to 5 the principles, the dimensions of complexity that need to be reckoned with to transform complex challenges. Each of these principles can be aligned with a capability, actually multiple capabilities, but again, to stay on the far side of complexity, the simplicity on the far side of complexity, we're going to speak about just one such capability. So here's In this next slide, you'll see our effort to articulate in a very brief way what this meta capability that could be called complexity capability is constituted by. So any capability is an ecosystem of distinct competencies. A meta capability is an ecosystem of capabilities. And so complexity capability, viewed in this way, is a meta capability. And there are some other distinctions on the slide that can be useful down the road. But in the interests of our short journey here, we'll move on to what are the capabilities that align with each of these principles. So with the principle of surrender, we would explore what is negative capability. This is a phrase from the poet John Keats, who died at the age of 26, but has become a part of the legacy of the British Romantics. And another way to speak about negative capability could be mystical capability. It's how we engage not only the unknown, but how we engage the unknowable. And this is part of the complexity of reality and therefore a part of complex challenges, that we are seeking to transform complex challenges with a great deal of unknown and a great deal of unknowable, so that complexity capability is not primarily about prior knowledge, but how we respond to the unknown and the unknowable, and what is that capability. Imaginative capability aligns with the principle we're referring to as multiplicity, the essential heterogeneity of being. Reality is complex because it is heterogeneous. It is infinitely heterogeneous. And yet it is whole, and therefore the value of an integral approach. Reality is one whole and infinitely heterogeneous. Therefore, the need to mobilize our powers of imagination that enable the distinctness of reality to come through, and for us to be able to recognize and engage those differences. I'll mention parenthetically that the intent Zach and I have is that we would be cycling through these capabilities as we go through each of the modules that Zach will be presenting right after my comments. And then depending on the module, we would emphasize one or more of these capabilities and how they constitute together our ability to transform complex challenges through complexity capability. Moving on then to perspectival capability, which is associated with the principle of development. Many of you, I'm sure, are quite familiar with developmental theory, so you immediately recognize how important an understanding of perspective has been to developmental theory. Our understanding of development, not just for individuals, but also for collectives at various levels, from dyads to teams to organizations and to societies. And the degree to which we can hold different perspectives, gather different perspectives, and seek different perspectives. A lot more could be said here, but I'll move on for today. The next capability is associated with the principle of embodiment. Embodiment not just understood in its exterior sense, but also in its interior sense. This is a capability we also sometimes refer to as reflexive capability. Autopoiesis is a term introduced by Francisco Varela and Humberto Maturana, biologists from Chile. And it has had a great deal of influence in many disciplines. And it has to do with understanding how the self-creating powers of the cosmos as a whole and in all the splendor of uniqueness that individuality is elaborated through. And finally, the dimension of collaboration. Again, so many capabilities that are associated with collaboration and how collaboration enables us to engage and transform complexity. We're choosing to focus on accountability capability and how this particular capability, when it is mobilized within individuals, dyads, teams, organizations, and societies, what a huge possibility for flourishing outcomes is opened as a result of that, and how much belonging is supported when systems can be accountable. A lot more to say, and perhaps there will be further opportunity once Zach has given us a flight over the modules.
Great. Thank you, Aftab. Yes, what I'm going to do now is present an overview of the course kind of as a whole to give you, as Aftab said, the view from 3,000 feet. And, what the whole course is focused on is this notion of complexity capacity. And the reason this is essential is because we live in an epoch or an era, kind of a historical period that is characterized by overwhelming complexity. And capacity, right? That capacity, eats complexity for breakfast, right? So the idea is, how can we possibly survive in such a dramatically complex world? It's by building new capacities for handling complexity. And so what this course attempts to do is provide frameworks, which are meta-theoretical frameworks that allow you to understand and characterize and see complexity in new ways. But then we're also offering transformational practices that build capacity and allow you to actually transform and thrive on complexity. So this isn't just about coping with complexity. This is actually about using complexity to do things that would not be, that would be impossible without that complexity. Sometimes this is called anti-fragile systems. So there are some systems that break when they're confronted with additional complexity. There are other systems, like the human nervous system and some ecosystems, that actually the introduction of new complexity creates more capacity in that system. So we're trying to create a form of anti-fragile systems here. So just a word about the course itself. We're going to be doing weekly video calls like these in Zoom. And, this is not a canned teleseminar. This is, in fact, a deeply interactive and in many ways unscripted educational experience. So it's going to involve some lecture, but it's also going to involve a lot of practices. We're going to use Zoom to break the large group into smaller groups so that you can be in more intimate discussion type frameworks. So this isn't you sitting back and listening to some talking heads. In fact, we're going to deeply involve you in the process. And that involves also getting you into Meridian's online learning platform. There we're going to be posting readings and PDFs. We're going to make available the recordings of each weekly session. There will be discussion forums that allow you to kind of work and build a learning community with the rest of your cohort, and also some take-home practices that will give you an opportunity to ground what we're discussing in the realities of your life. The goal is to create a kind of emergent learning community that will have a life of its own even beyond the end of the class. And this is a learning community that's international, And it comes, a lot of diversity in terms of the types of practitioners and their domain ecosystems, which is, where they do their work. So that's a sense of the container we're creating. We're bringing in, aside from Aftab and I, some very exciting visiting faculty. So this includes Jean Houston, who really needs no introduction. But then on the left there, we have Tim Winton, who's an Australian permaculturalist turned organizational development theorist who does work with complex dynamical systems with his framework called pattern dynamics. And then Rob McNamara, who is a conflict facilitation expert who works for an organization called 10 Directions. He will help us understand the complexity of culture and the complexity of conflict itself. So they will be joining us at various points during the course and kind of giving some meat to the practices and theory that we're discussing. So the main themes of the course have already been raised, but I'll rehearse them a bit. Unprecedented complexity characterizes our time, and it's complexity in all worlds, and this is essential. There's complexity in self that's unprecedented, complexity in culture, complexity in behavior and ecosystem, complexity in new forms of institution, new forms of social system. And what we're trying to do in this class is find a way to see new patterns in complexity, and that requires pulling on what we call transdisciplinary or meta-theoretical frameworks, such as integral theory, critical realism, archetypal psychology, developmental psychology, dynamic systems theory. We're going to be pulling from kind of a toolkit of different meta-theoretical approaches to allow us to see things in fundamentally new ways. And then most importantly, to see through the surface of the incomprehensible into the deeper structure of what's comprehensible with complexity. And then, of course, you're going to be focusing on not just ideas, but things we can do in our lives and in our professional world that can help us transform this complexity and to thrive off of it. I'm going to run through each of the 7 modules now very quickly to give you kind of a taste of what is coming. So the first module is really an overview, and we're looking at the general principles of complexity that Aftab mentioned and a few more, but we're also focusing on this idea that complexity is in each world. And so many of you know Ken Wilber's 4 quadrants, and that's an example of one of the meta theories we're going to use, but it's just one. There are others. But the key with the 4 quadrants here is that complexity arises not just in our social systems, not just in our culture, not just in our psyches, but in all of it at the same time. And increases in sociocultural complexity have ramifications in the self and have ramifications in culture. So it's about tracing the lines of complexity across the different worlds and realizing that there's kind of no escaping from complexity, even if you'd like to hide out and meditate. In fact, the monastery you're going to probably has some complex, financial structure that would have been unprecedented even 10 years ago. So there's just a way that it's all intertwined, and we need to come to grips with that first. So that's the first module, is about that big picture view of just what the complexity crisis is and what do we face. The next one is about locating each student in the course, having them locate their domain of practice. So it's about anchoring the locus of your professional practice. And so it's not just that complexity is in each of these worlds, let's say ontologically, but it's also in each of these domains, let's say institutionally. So the complexity crisis manifests in education, it manifests in business, it manifests in psychotherapy and religion, civil society. Across all the major institutional domains, there's unprecedented forms of complexity. And what's important in the course is that there are patterns in that complexity. There are isomorphisms or parallels between what's happening in education, what's happening in healthcare, what's happening in psychotherapy. And we're going to trace those commonalities and differences. And the learning community will emerge as diverse practitioners come together and share just what the challenges are that they're facing. Then we turn away from the outside world, away from the 4 quadrants and the kind of different domains in which, complexity has been manifesting, and we look into the nature of the self. And so the third module is focused on the nature of consciousness, the nature of the self, and the need to rearticulate who we are, not as a static kind of essential entity, but in fact, understanding the self and the mind as a processual entity. And this figure here, which is a fascinating encapsulation of the dynamics and processual nature of the mind, this is a figure actually of a psychotherapeutic dyad, which is to say, this is just 2 people talking over about 45 minutes. But you'll notice that On the top, the kind of beads along the strings, those are the emotional complexity, right? Positive emotion, negative emotion. Then the kind of up and down, graphs on the bottom, that has to do with the concepts and the developmental level. And what you'll see is over the course of 45 minutes, these two individuals are in constant process. They're moving up and down different levels of development. They're having positive and negative emotion. They're exchanging big ideas and small ideas. And so instead of thinking about the self as a type, we're thinking about the self as being at a particular level. We're going to come to believe and see the way that the self is actually many things at once. The multiplicity of the self, the dynamic, constant changing nature of the self, and how that re-understanding can help us manage complexity. Because instead of seeing complexity as kind of penetrating and breaking the self, which should be this pristine, never-changing thing, we realize that the self can move and flow in complex circumstances. So that's the third module, has us looking in the mirror. Then we move on to look at ourselves externally, right? So we're looking at the nature of biology and behavior, the human nervous system, the nature of complex dynamical systems in general. So this is a figure, of course, of a chaotic attractor. And the chaotic attractor is exactly the kind of thing we're trying to look at across all domains, because the chaotic attractor is the structure within complexity. It's the hidden patterns that we don't see on the surface. And there are many of these patterns in our own behavior and in ecosystems or nonlinear systems in general. So we're going to learn to understand the self as processual, but we're also going to learn to understand our actions and skills as multidimensional. That we are, in fact, a complex, evolving ecosystem in itself. The mind is a complex, evolving ecosystem of co-evolving skills. And so we're going to start to piece apart just what that means and the implications, not just for our own self-care and self-development, but the implications for the compassion and relationships we have with others. Instead of putting them in stereotypical boxes that simplify their complexity, we're looking for a way to get at a deeper understanding of the complexity of self and other. So that's the fourth module, which again brings us about the nature of the self. Then we turn away from the kind of individual and start looking at the culture and the social systems. And it's critical to understand that one of the things that's taking place in the midst of our contemporary complexity crisis is a clamping down of traditional forms of organizational structure and their transformation into increasingly kind of coercive forms of bureaucracy and surveillance. So measurement and the colonialization of time are increasingly characterizing our experiences at work and in other institutions, where because we're so overwhelmed by the complexity of things, we're clamping down extra hard to, make sure everyone's working more hours and documenting all their work. And all of these things are emerging in response to complexity. But the question here is, to what extent are we squelching individual difference and squelching innovation for the sake of perpetuating a broken system? So what we're looking at here, and this is where Tim will join us from Pattern Dynamics, the goal here is to think about, we need a fundamentally new type of social system, a fundamentally new type of organization that thrives on complexity and doesn't try to protect itself from complexity through bureaucratization, et cetera. And so this is a picture of the Oakland Hub, which is a kind of innovation center in Oakland that Meridian has partnered with. And it's a great example of how a new social space and a new way of thinking about how human organizations can function is possible and is already emerging today in response to the complexity crisis. And then we're going to look at not the social systems and the organizational structures, but the culture itself, the shared meanings, the norms and the values that we have. And we live in a time in which we are in a kind of species-wide identity crisis, where we have a very fragmented sense of what it is that we value and what it is that our cultures ought to be like. So this is, of course, a very famous picture where an African-American woman is walking into one of the first desegregated schools. And you can see behind her a white woman yelling, kind of full of rage. And of course, the 60s in the United States was a time of tremendous cultural upheaval. And we are living again in a time of tremendous cultural upheaval. What's remarkable about this picture is that these two women lived a very long time. And a few years ago, in their 80s, they were actually reunited. And the white woman had overcome her racism and was in tears and embracing the African-American woman. And so this is an example of just how profoundly cultures can shift in a matter of decades. And we are in one of those fulcrum points now. We are in one of those transition points now. But instead of yelling at one another and, like this face to face, we yell at one another through social media. On Facebook, we yell at, we're in cars, we're in lines, we're increasingly stressed, we're increasingly confused about our most fundamental values. So we're going to use an opportunity with Rob McNamara, who's a conflict facilitation expert, to think about, well, what does it mean to be involved in really dynamic, potentially explosive cultural conflict, which is what surrounds many of us today. So that's just another look at the complexity crisis through culture. And then in the final week, we are going to be, in essence, bringing everything together and grounding things in practice again. So, each of the modules will address principles and will address practices. But in the final module, we're actually probably going to be turning over a lot of what we're discussing to the students so that they can bring the lessons that they've learned from the course and kind of let us know what's going to happen after the course ends. Because really the goal here is that we are giving you a launch pad to continue further learning and a kind of, base camp from which to explore your higher capacities. So the goal with this last week is to make sure that you have all the equipment you need to continue exploring, is the basic idea. So these are the 7 modules. And again, there'll be a rhythm of live interaction through Zoom, supplemented by interfacing through the Meridian online learning platform. So I'd like to give it back to Aftab here to give some closing sentiments.
Thanks, Zach. I'll pick up on the theme you signaled around compassion with one of the last slides about the 2 women who have now reconciled. When we are working in the course on autopoietic or reflexive capability, one of the dimensions of that we want to look at is compassion. And what is it about complexity capability that includes the compassionate dimension? So how is it that further development enables us to understand perspectives better, and that the complexity of perspectives, we might say, in an oversimplified way, is the cognitive aspect of compassion as distinct from the emotional aspect of compassion. So transforming complex challenges entails this capacity of compassion. And we see, for example, in the racism, in the scapegoating that was in that slide, a failure of complex understanding. And we are in a continuing wave after wave of scapegoating at a global level. Therefore, the importance of complexity capability. One last point before we open for questions and comments that Zach and I might respond to is the point that complex challenges are not a new thing. They're not a modern thing or a postmodern thing. Complex challenges, reality is complex, and so our species has been faced with complex challenges all along. In fact, we could understand both the physical and cultural evolution of Homo sapiens sapiens by understanding how our species has gone about meeting complex challenges. So as recently or as early as 3,000 years ago, we see in the Odyssey in terms of its text stabilized around 320 BC and was in the oral tradition for at least another 300 years prior to that. So here we have one of the 2 or 3 earliest stories of Western civilization. And it begins with the words, "Sing to me, O muse, of the man of many ways," referring to Odysseus. And partly one can understand the Odyssey as a book that is about Odysseus's complexity capability, and how we see already by then that some of the earlier imaginings of what the hero is in Greek mythology, in Greek civilization, is already transforming, and that the emphasis is not on the particular amazing abilities of particular gods, but this mortal who is a person of many ways. So perhaps by shifting to responding to your questions and comments, we can begin to ground our high altitude flight.
Thank you, Aftab. I'd just like to remind people how to submit questions and comments. Submit using the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and click on the left-hand side. You'll see a column that says participants. Scroll to comments and questions and submit all your comments and questions to that participant. We've received a lot of comments and enthusiasm, and we appreciate that. And I'll go to the first question. Does autopoietic capability encompass somatic intelligence? If not, where does this capability fit into your model?
So I'm sure Zach will have some additional comments, but I'll just say 2 or 3 sentences. This is the capability we are linking to the principle of embodiment. And embodiment is a mystery. 2 or 3 years ago, we did a virtual summit, and the theme was the mystery of embodiment. So there's much to say, but I'll just say it simply right now that embodiment has to do with the unique emergence of structure. Unique emergence of structure. And so for sure, what we ordinarily refer to as somatic intelligence would be very much a part of it, and a lot more. Over to Zach for anything further.
I would agree with that, the alignment between the principle of embodiment and the capacity of autopoietic or reflective awareness is essential. And it's about the emergence of structure, but it's also about the maintenance of structure through its reflective recreation. This is what autopoetics means. It means not just that the structure is there, but that the structure creates itself and perpetuates itself. And a lot of what we face with complexity crises are threats to the autopoietic dynamics of some of our essential systems, because they cannot recreate themselves in the way that they have habitually. They need to find new ways to recreate themselves, which is to say higher order or higher level forms of autopoiesis. And at the individual level, that means, again, the kinds of embodied awareness that allow you to, for lack of a better word, intuitively adapt your patterns and practices to new higher level ways of dealing with the world.
Excellent. The next question we have is, can you give some examples of practices, ways we can embrace complexity without having to overthink it?
This is an interesting one. So complexity capability, of course, has a great deal to do with attentional competencies. And attentional competencies, of course, at an individual level, but also, again, at the other levels of human systems, dyads, teams, organizations, etc. So and how a particular human system, and of course an individual human being, is also a human system. So how this great symphony, this great dance of wholeness and differentiation gets played out has a great deal to do with this competency.
Yeah, and I'll add that one of the key concepts we're going to be working with, probably starting in the second module, is the idea of a second simplicity, right? So there is complexity in the world, period. And you can deal with it by oversimplifying it, which is by reducing the complexity to a form of simplicity that is on this side, which is to say, you've oversimplified. And for example, many measurement practices like GDP, gross domestic product, right? National economies are very complicated. So what do? We simplify them to one number. That is an example of what's called a first simplicity, where you downgrade the complexity to a lesser form of simplicity. But there is also what's called a second simplicity. And this is the simplicity on the other side of complexity, right? And so an example of that in national accounting, just to mirror the GDP example, is what's called the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient is a simplification, but what it does is it actually represents economic inequality, right? So it's not just one number, it's several numbers that show the spread between the wealthiest and the least wealthy. So that's a form of simplicity that's on the other side of complexity because it reveals key essential features of the complex phenomenon. It doesn't just get the complexity out of the way with a pat answer. So much of what we're going to be seeking through our practices is ways of embodying and kind of codifying this kind of second simplicity so that we don't oversimplify complexity, but in fact metabolize it and have a way of handling it that is not like, seeing all the variables all at once like some incredibly, omniscient being, but in fact making the right kinds of simplifications, making the right kinds of parsimonious moves. And this is where meta theory will come in handy, because we'll learn to, what are the principled ways to simplify complexity that doesn't oversimplify complexity? Right? What's the quote by Einstein? It was something like, make the problem as simple as possible, but no simpler. And that's the trick.
A little more I will add, because the person who asked the question aptly used the word overthinking. So of course, our over-reliance on conceptual capabilities is partly what we were addressing by our emphasis on practices that transform complex challenges. Because part of, and this has been partly relates to the limitations of how we do higher education, is we emphasize conceptual capabilities so much that in fact graduates of higher education institutions are not as prepared to meet complex challenges, because complex challenges require more than conceptual capability. So we need to complexify what we recognize as actionable knowledge. And part of our course will include the range of work that is referred to as action inquiry or developmental action inquiry, partly drawing on our colleague Bill Torbert's work as one of the key practices. Back to you, Stephanie. You're on mute.
Thank you. The next question coming in is, how can we coach or lead or empower people to be ready to accept the dark side of complexity, like corruption, conflict, politics, play? And how can we lead the ambiguity of the preservation of power with the social responsibility?
Wow. What an invitation. The discipline will be to only say a few sentences. So one of the verses from the Tao Te Ching goes, darkness within darkness the gateway to all understanding. And so the first principle that Zach and I have proposed for our inquiry is surrender. And this is one way to speak about the Tao alignment, telic alignment, as in telos, how alignment itself shifts how our understanding of what is dark, what is light, what is play, what is work. Because, as you'll recall, this great book, perhaps the longest standing book of wisdom, begins with the words, "The Tao that can be named is not the Tao."
It's hard to follow the Tao Te Ching, but I would echo Aftab's sentiment that this is in some ways the core of that first principle, that in fact being a leader, being a coach, in an era that's characterized by such overwhelming complexity, it requires a fundamentally new way of conceiving leadership and conceiving coaching. Because today the leader is not the one who sees the path forward clearly and can predict what's going to happen in the future. In fact, the leader is the one who can hold the space of not knowing and who can allow other people the freedom to not know and still feel secure, right? And so it's tricky. And I'll also mention the work of Adam Kaheen in this book, It's Power in Love, right? And this is essential, that at the same time, there's a dark side of complexity, which is to say there's increasing corruption, there's increasing opportunities for, oppression and exploitation. There is also a light side of complexity, which is to say we are unprecedentedly connected to one another in the global commons like never before. So while there's opportunity for perverse use of power, there's also opportunity for unprecedented forms of love and cohesion. And so some of what the course is not simply seeing complexity as a pejorative, because that's just managing complexity, tolerating complexity. We want to thrive on complexity so that we come to see complexity as a positive and to transform its negatives and to transmute the negative into the potential for positivity. But the point about coaching and leadership is essential, and it's very likely that many participants in the course will have this on the front of their mind, which is, how do I act as a leader? How do I empower others with these new capacities? So we're looking forward to handling that challenge.
Thank you, Zach. Our next question is, will we talk about how the heart handles complexity?
Pascal, the heart has its own reasons. So absolutely. As most of you are likely aware, that along with this amazing burst of neuroscience knowledge that became possible with the arrival of PET scans in particular, a great deal of interest has gone towards emotion. And we understand now that a great deal depends on the limbic system of leaders. And let me opportunistically pick on Donald Trump and mirror his opportunism just for a moment here. So when we can see how Trump is opportunistically using the limbic system, the emotion system, in all the ways he utilizes his emotion, his facial affects, etc. And so the heart, great mystery of the heart, is not just about emotion, but it is one of the key dimension of the mystery of the heart that modernity has turned away from. And so for sure, that deeply weakens our ability to meet complex challenges. And one of our themes is going to be how the emotions transmute into distinct capability. So what is the link between grief and compassion, between fear and courage, for example, between shame and conscience? And what does the particular way in which Trump is shame numb and shameless, what is the role of that in the way in which he is communicating effectively in the narrow sense?
Yeah, great example, drawing on the new emergences of the emotional neurosciences, and some of the readings we've actually already building into the learning platform will focus on these new sciences of emotion and cognition. I'll mention, to echo some of what Aftab said, one of the risks in an epoch of complexity, and especially ours, is the risk of closing your heart. Because what happens when you have so much at your fingertips, right? We have, through the World Wide Web, a kind of pseudo-omniscience. It's as if we are aware of everything that's happening in the world. And so we have the Syrian civil war broadcast into our living room in high definition. And we're aware of what's happening in Africa and what's happening in South America. Unprecedented access to things that will break your heart. And so one of the responses to that kind of complexity is to simply close your heart, because there's a sense that I can't possibly respond. So just like the negative capability of holding open the unknowing in the cognitive realm, there's a kind of negative capability of the heart, which is the ability to hold the heart open, even though the world is constantly breaking it. And one of the patterns we find in this epoch of complexity is too many people closing their hearts or lashing out with anger in response to what should be an upwelling of compassion for the suffering of the world. So again, transmuting that energy of fear, transmuting the desire to close the heart into an energy of love and an opening is some of the kinds of practices we need to work to cultivate. And it's worth saying, I'll speak for myself. I have no idea how this is going to, what exactly we're going to do that. And this is why what's so exciting about the course is that the course itself is an action inquiry. So as much as Aftab and I, are professors and can profess to know, there's a very real way in which we will all learn from one another what it takes to, for example, keep your heart open in the face of the barrage of constant images that will break it. So that's just a kind of leaning into that space of, from the heart and how will we handle these types of issues. It's essential. Nothing gets done if the heart's not open.
Everything depends on our ability to be affected. That's the essential meaning of passion and compassion. Today, Zach and I are doing our Talking Heads version, but in the course we'll be dancing and crying and drawing on myth and story and poetry, and interweaving that with meta theory, because the complexity of reality in its splendor of wholeness requires us meeting that complexity with our full splendor, and the building of a learning community through the platform. So we're using Zoom to keep us in visual communion, but then there's the asynchronous platform that where the resources will be, where participants' bios and photos will be, and where the asynchronous interactivity is really as important a part of what could emerge in this in the convergence that this course is desiring to be. We are at 11 o'clock. However, there are a lot of questions still. We can stay on somewhat longer, and we will. And feel free to log out as you need to. A recording of the webinar will be available, so So you'll be able to watch the last part if you need to log out now. But we'll stay on and be responsive to some of the questions that are pending.
Thanks, Aftab. The next question is, we are clamping down and colonizing time in ways that make life more difficult in order to deal with complexity. Why do we keep doing this if it is so bad for us? Can you elaborate?
Yeah, I can jump in there since I kind of started that way of thinking about it with that slide. So there's, when systems are in flux, when it feels like the wheels are coming off, the tendency is to clamp down harder and to try to keep the broken system from falling apart. And so you'll see this across most of our major institutions right now. Large scale agribusiness, the financial sector, education itself, all of them are being undermined in a way from the perspective of the system. They're being undermined by new emergent forms of production and commerce and online education. And so what you're seeing in response to that emergent complexity is the opposite of thriving. You're seeing the first simplicity of reacting against it. And so it's understandable. Similarly, in our own lives, it's often the case that when it feels like things are falling apart, we'll try to get even a more regimented way of dealing with it. And so the trick is to kind of fall out of that pattern of fear and into a pattern of embracing and transmuting complexity. But it is the case that we live in a time, as you're saying, that it's becoming increasingly difficult to live and to work because many of these major systems are failing. And that's critical to understand. So the question of why we do that, even though it keeps hurting us, that's a deeper question that gets into some of the emotional and psychodynamic aspects of the human self system. So for example, if you've built your entire life on the belief that this way of growing tomatoes is good, and then all of this scientific evidence starts emerging that actually this way of growing tomatoes is damaging, it's hard to just admit that you've been wrong for years. So there's that simple motivation to keep going the way things were. And then there's the lack of negative capacity to not know what's coming next. We deeply want to know what's coming next. And if the wheels are coming off and you let them come off, you have no idea what's going to happen. Even holding them on with duct tape and chewing gum seems better than just letting them fall off. So that's again, there's an emotional component there. So I could say a lot more about that, but I'll leave it there and see if Aftab has some reflections.
The colonization of time is a aspect of the larger issue of the colonization of experience. Mircea Eliade said, "The sacred is saturated with being." And many of you likely know Martin Heidegger's magnum opus, Being and Time. So when experience is colonized, there's a contraction in relation to time. And while complexity challenges are not modern or postmodern, they take particular form in modernity and postmodernity. The way in which time is colonized, and the way time is colonized even for 8-year-olds, 5-year-olds. I was just hearing from my colleague at Meridian, Laura Purcell, about her 5-year-old grandson and how he speaks about being stressed out by a particular learning assignment. And so this colonization of experience and its subset, the colonization of time, has gone to another level in postmodernity and represents, and its transformation is truly a complex challenge. More, Steph?
Thank you, Aftab. We have a couple more questions here. And our next one is, about some practical questions that I can respond to. They're wondering the dates of the sessions and will the sessions be recorded? And I'm happy to say that yes, definitely the sessions will be recorded and they'll be distributed after. This will help you still engage with your cohort and faculty and stay up to date, asynchronous. Excuse me, tongue-tied. The dates of the session, will have 7 live sessions, and they'll be once a week on Thursdays at 10 a.m. You can find more specifics on our website, and I will send everyone the link there to get all the continuing details. I'll leave it at that, but let you know that you can contact me or visit the website, and the link I'll send out to get some more of the logistical questions taken care of. Off-top or Zach, did you want to say anything else on the practical side? Okay.
Just we're even more excited about the course from just having this hour to feel into it. And so I'll just say excitement is a very practical thing along with theory.
Well, we have a couple more questions that we would like to get to. Our next one is a very good question. This is a lot for a 7-week course. Does the theme of this course feed directly into any of your degree programs?
So complexity capability is one of our institutional learning outcomes. It applies to all our 3 programs, articulated in somewhat different ways. But whatever profession we are engaged in or are looking to engage in, as the slide about institutional domains that Zach spoke to suggests, whichever profession it is, it has its complex challenges requiring complexity, capability, and what the professions need is to be sacralized or resacralized depending on their particular history. And that wholeness of being that is required is, again, comes back to the kind of practices that Meridian's curriculum embodies. So yes, and our commitment, Zach's and my commitment, is to make the 7-week course whole on its own terms, so that there is a sense of completion in terms of some distinct practices that are linked to distinct capabilities being able to carry forward for you personally and professionally. Do we fully know how to do that in a 7-week online course? No. Do we intend to learn? Yes. So our commitment is to learn to do that as best as we can over these 7 weeks.
Thank you, Avtaz. We'll move on to our next question. Can you elaborate on some of the practices that will be part of the course? And is it possible to share an example of an embodiment practice offered in the course?
You know, it's been, there is some research which has been elaborated upon by saying that the origins of thinking are in movement. So, I mean, this is a staggering claim and also a very compelling one, the relationship between movement and thinking and more broadly, movement and awareness. So one example is while we're in our Zoom phone calls each week, our 90-minute phone calls, we won't be doing movement practices, but we will be assigning movement-related practices among other practices, both in relation to the attentional competencies that are linked to movement practices, but more broadly as well. One of the exciting potentials of Zoom as a platform is that we can also do divide the larger group into small groups, so that these breakout groups will be part of the 90-minute period. And in the breakout groups, there'll be an opportunity to share some of the experience of the asynchronous practicing that participants are doing. So the breakout groups will be practice groups in a certain sense, and enabling also the possibility that some of the breakout groups may decide to meet synchronously on their own, separate from the 90-minute once-a-week sessions. Over to Zach for...
Yeah, I'll add, which is that starting in week 2, not week 2, module 2, but it will be week 2, we begin to have each participant locate themselves in a domain of practice. And part of that is going to be actually identifying a particular, what I would call a conundrum of complexity, right? So the idea here is that early on in the modules, in the asynchronous learning platform, each person offers a kind of case study that they're going to be working on throughout the rest of the modules. And this through line through the course will be grappling with the same problem that's live for you that you can act on in your own world, as a way of doing some action research based on the principles of the classes. So not only will we have embodied practices and breakout groups, but the idea is to tie it directly into some themes and that are very much kind of pressing issues in each individual's life. And many of them, I guess, will be overlapping. Many people have similar challenges. So throughout it, the goal is to ground these in practice and to make the whole thing practical and valuable immediately.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Aftab. Given the time, we'll take one more question. Thanks again to everyone for the excellent questions and comments that have come in. If you have any additional comments, don't hesitate to email us or, and so, okay, the last question. How to form questions as a leader without leading people on. How to help people empower themselves so that they can feel and use it, feel the spirit of the wholeness and connectedness and their essential part in it. How to.
This one's a beauty. Zach, you already began to speak along those lines earlier. Will you extend?
Yeah, and I think that the challenge here is, well, first of all, asking that question is the first step, like the beauty and the complexity of the question, right? So if you're already asking that question, you're probably pretty far along. But I will say, and kind of reiterate what I already said, that the new challenge of leadership is not knowing. It's not knowing, right? The challenge of leadership is not knowing, and yet continuing to build trust and continuing to build an inspired team and continuing to set a direction, even though you're not exactly sure what's happening next. And so framing the questions that you would ask as a leader or a coach to the people that you're working with most closely that will allow them to see the unknown and not be afraid of it is some of what we have to grapple with. Again, it's about the dark side and the light side of the complexity. You can see the unknown as frightening, or you can see the unknown as potentiated, as pregnant with possibility. And so transmuting that energy from fear to possibility is it's the key challenge of our age, really, because we can step back and we can be overwhelmed and disaffected and kind of shrug and say, what can we do? Or we can step into it, lean into it, and try to find a way forward that's going to work for everybody. So again, my sense is that Aftab and I may not be able to give you a formula or a recipe for doing that. But what we're doing is creating a container in which hopefully the question and the answer will come to you or come to your other participants. So really I don't have a great answer to that right now, but I bet by the end of the 7 weeks, we as a group will have some pretty interesting and profound ways to think about that new form of leadership and the kinds of questions and prodding and work that leader does with teams.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Aftab. That was our last question, and I'd like to turn it over to you, to both of you right now, just for some closing comments before we get ready to wrap up.
The Tao that can be named is not the Tao.
I told you he was the closest thing to a wizard that I'd ever met. I'll just say I was excited before to do this, and now having heard all of these questions, I'm even more excited. And I think that so much of the learning that's going to take place in this course is going to be from the cohort of participants, and that Aftab and I are going to be honored to be the humble guides through this journey. So I'm really inviting that learning opportunity for myself, and feeling it as profoundly likely, given just the level of the questions that we've already received in this hour. I'm thrilled and honored to be a part of this. Thanks everyone for the time and your attention.
Thank you, Zach. And thank you, Aftab. And thank you to everyone for joining us on the preview call today. We hope that we have inspired you to continue the conversation and learning. We launch our 7-week course, Thriving on Complexity, next week. It's on Thursday, March 24th. You can enroll and learn more about the course directly through our website, meridianuniversity.edu/complexity course. You'll find the link in your chat window. And you can also send me a direct email with any questions, any concerns, comments. Stephanie Silva at meridianuniversity.edu. We did have one closing comment that I would just like to address, that wondering if there was a space for non-professional participants. And I would just definitely like to say that this course is for individuals who are personally or professionally working in and with complex challenges. You can choose to apply all the learnings in either context. So yes, it is open for a non-professional participant. I would just like to thank you all again for your presence, your comments, your questions. We're so encouraged, and we hope to see you in the course next week. Thank you.